Okay, so we'll get started. Everybody has the option to unmute themselves and ask a question. My name is Rich Conroy. I'm the Director of Education at Bike New York. I've been at Bike New York for a little over 15 years. And I started our bike ed program, and we're best known for starting a program that teaches people how to ride a bike for the first time. But at those classes, I get a lot of questions from people who just learned how, when, where, why they should buy a bike. And so I also used to work in a bike shop, a chain of stores here locally in New York City called Metro Bicycles. When the owners of that retired, they sold it to another local chain in Westchester called Danny's, who then sold most of the New York City parts of their chain to Trek, the bike manufacturer. I'm also a veteran of buying a lot of bikes over the years for myself. I like to buy bikes. I like shopping for bikes. I think bikes are fascinating, beautiful machines, works of art when they're done right, not works of art when they're not done right, though. I have made a few mistakes along the way in terms of bikes that just didn't seem to work out right for me or fit right, including a couple of big mistakes in terms of bikes that were just the wrong size for me. So we'll go over that, making sure you get the right size. All right, let's look and see what we've got going on in chat. So we have a question from Tricia who says, my question, how do you know what kind of bike to get in terms of mountain bike, road bike, commuter, hybrid? Also, does brand matter? Those are very good questions. And I used to, when I worked in a shop, I would get people asking, particularly that first question, quite a bit. They'd walk in, and this back then, this was like 2000, 2001, 2002, that kind of in there, 20 years ago. Probably there were fewer choices in terminology in a way that made things simpler. There were still, I'd say, plenty of choices. All right, so we have a question. Teresa Palazzo. Teresa asks, how important is it to be sized for a bike in person? That's also a good question. Tricia asks a follow-up question. Is it okay to be fiscally conservative when purchasing your first bike, or should it be more high quality on the more expensive side? That's a good question too. I don't think I have a good answer to that, but we can kind of talk a little bit about it. And then John says, I wish to transition from a hybrid to a road bike. First time purchase of a road bike. I envision acclimating to a road bike by riding laps in Central Park as well as around NYC. Accordingly, I don't require an aggressive geometry. What should I consider when purchasing an entry-level or beginner road bike? Okay, those are all really great questions. It sounds like John already owns a bike, but a couple of you may be first-timers, or it may have been a long time since you purchased a bike. All right, let's move on here. So I'll try to make sure I get to these questions. We'll go through this slide deck. If you have questions as we go along, you can either add them to chat, or you can just ask, unmute yourself and interrupt me and ask verbally. There's not a lot of people in this class, so I don't think that'll be too disruptive. So of course we have a lot of choices in the bike world. And I think we've gotten more choices and more terminology in the last 10 years, where before in say 2000, you could walk into a bike shop and look at road bikes, hybrids, and mountain bikes. And, within those categories, there'd be a couple of other subcategories. Like you could look at a road bike or a road touring bike, kind of variation on a theme. You could look at a hardtail mountain bike or a dual suspension mountain bike, like this one here. You could look at a hybrid that was more for city riding and errands, or a hybrid that was more lighter and racier and faster for fitness and sport. And then there were other things like folding bikes and beach cruisers and things like that out there. I'm going to say within each of the categories now, there's additional subcategories. There's additional categories under themselves, like urban bikes or commuting bikes. So adventure bikes, travel bikes, fat bikes seem to be their own category of mountain bikes sometimes. And then there's a lot of like new terminology and standards. Like when I was working in a bike shop, and I'm a mechanic also, you kind of had one bottom bracket standard. The bottom bracket is the bearing here that your crank rolls on. It's an important part because it takes a lot of work. It does a lot of work. And it was an English threaded bottom bracket, and they'd have different widths for mountain bikes and road bikes. In the last 10 years, the number of standards has just exploded, and I don't understand why. It's like the bike industry is trying to reinvent the wheel, reinvent the bottom bracket, and everybody's trying to create their own standard and their own supposedly improved gizmo. I, for myself, when I buy a new frame to build up, I kind of stick with a traditional English threaded bottom bracket that are easy to deal with. And I've got the tools for them. Okay, let's move on. We'll talk a little bit about where to buy a bike. We'll talk about questions to ask before you start looking. Questions to ask of yourself, really. And I think a couple of you have already started asking those questions. We'll kind of go through types of bikes. And if you're interested in a specific type, you should ask questions as we cover that. And I'll do my best to answer them. And we'll say a little bit about parts and components and frame materials. It sounds like none of you are buying kids' bikes, so we'll probably skip that section. I am going to say right now, and for much of 2020 and going into 2021, it is very hard to buy a bike. And what I mean by that is the bike shops, the places where you can go to purchase bikes, don't have them. I was in Trek stores several times this summer. We have a partnership with Trek, and I was doing some of our Zoom classes, including this one, in a couple of different Trek stores. And the only bikes they had were their top of the line, most expensive bikes that very few people can afford, which is why they still have those bikes. Everything else, including some still pretty expensive bikes, were gone. And I have heard stories that they don't see inventory coming back into the stores in a big way until next spring. Now, if there is a particular brand and model that you have decided you like, what I would do is work with the local bike shop that you like and say you want to get your hands on that brand and model. The supplier, like let's say you go with Giant. Giant may not have it, but you could keep bugging your bike shop and make sure that you kind of are at the top of their list if that's the bike you want. Let's go into where to buy a bike. I'm going to say bike shops are the best way to buy a bike. You have the best knowledge. You have the best assembly. The bikes do have to be assembled a little bit out of the box. You have the best backup support. If something goes out of adjustment on a new bike, and it will, particularly cables get stretched out, brake pads get worn in, things settle in a little bit, particularly with the cables, which means your brakes and your derailleurs. You're gonna have to take your bike back for some gear and some brake adjustments. And most bike shops will do that very quickly on the spot for free. Like when I worked at Metro, you could get free little adjustments like that. Your seat adjusted, your seat angle adjusted, your cables tweaked for free for 3 years. A lot of bike shops will offer that between 1 and 3 years. Now, when I worked at Metro, a decent entry-level 7-speed Raleigh city bike. It was kind of like a mountain bike with 1 gear in the front and 7 in the back. Was $200. I don't know if you could walk into a bike shop now and buy a bike for $200 unless it was very, very basic. Probably at a bike shop, you were looking at a starting price of $400, $450, maybe $350 if you're lucky. I'd have to go into a shop that actually has inventory and see what kind of pricing they have. So that's kind of one challenge for many people. When I worked in a shop in Queens, it was a pretty middle class neighborhood, Rego Park. People walk in and they were like, "Why are your bikes so expensive?" And I think they were probably getting these flyers in the mail from Target and Kmart on the weekends with their sporting goods sales, and they'd see a mountain bike selling for $89. We'll get into that in a second. And they'd come into our little Metro shop on Queens Boulevard, and they'd see mountain bikes for starting around $450, $300. The other thing about going to a bike shop is make sure that the shop is serving your needs and not theirs. If nobody pays attention to you or greets you, if you say, "I only have $500 to spend," and they try to sell you a $700 bike, even though they have a perfectly good $500 bike that is sitting right there. And I saw that happen once to a friend of mine. I took him into a Metro store, and the salesman stupidly tried to upsell him. And the guy walked out and bought the bike that he had the budget for somewhere else. You know, if you are getting a bad vibe from the staff, they ignore you, they talk down to you, they sort of give you an attitude, you know, with your questions, then that shop doesn't want to make a sale very badly, at least the staff don't, and you should go to a shop that does. Now, there are online retailers. Bikes Direct is the best known one. And I found their bikes are pretty good bargains for the amount of money that you spend. You don't get the service. Like, you have to assemble the bike or take the bike to a shop to have it assembled. It's going to come partially disassembled in the box. If something needs to be adjusted, a local bike shop is going to charge you for it, even if it's a basic, quick little adjustment. And you might have to wait as opposed to one of the bikes that they sold. The thing with buying a bike online is that you need to do your homework, especially when it comes to making sure the bike fits correctly. And one of our participants, I think it was Teresa, asked about that, and we will get to bike fit in a bit. I think Bikes Direct ships their bikes for free. I bought one bike from them. I've bought bikes online from a company in Michigan called Adventuron. I bought frames from different companies online, but I'm kind of an expert in the field, right? So I most of the time know what I'm doing. I have a couple of other online retailers listed out there. These all actually have brick and mortar stores. REI, of course, is nationwide, and they have a store in New York City. They have one across the river in Paramus, New Jersey. They have one in Yonkers, and they have one in Long Island. So they have a lot of stores around. These other two are West Coast, California chains. But you can still order bikes online from them. Now we have a bike shop. If you're having troubles finding a new bike, you could check our Recycle a Bike shop. Most New York City shops do not sell used bikes. You can ask around, but in my experience, most of them don't mess with it. But Recycle a Bike takes donated bikes, checks them over, fixes anything that's old, damaged, broken, and puts that bike back into good, usable, rideable condition. But it also means you don't have a full selection. It's whatever they managed to get donated and what they had time to put back together and put out on the floor. I was working as a mechanic for them this summer during COVID, and whatever I was fixing up and sending to them probably was pretty random from one week to another. You can also try local Craigslist and local eBay. There are a lot of people selling used bikes. Some of those used bikes can be in very nice condition, but you do have to know what you're doing when it comes to assessing the condition of the bike and knowing whether or not that bike is going to fit you correctly. Now, here's what I would avoid doing, and that's buying a bike via a big box store. In fact, these big box stores, I have a Target near me in the Bronx, and they didn't have any bikes all summer long. Their racks were empty. But I have noticed that Target has some kids and adult bikes back in stock. Now, the thing with these big box stores, the bikes themselves might be decent. They might not. Oftentimes, the manufacturer is producing a one size only frame, and you don't buy shoes or pants or coats that way. So that is a problem right there. The sizing might not work for you. The person assembling the bike is also assembling lawnmowers, grills, store furniture, store structures, things like that. And they're not really a bike mechanic. And I've seen some disasters walking out of bike stores where things were upside down, things were not tight. I'm also going to say I've seen, particularly some of the cheaper brands out there have parts that are just really, really cheap, and they don't hold up. They don't even hold up to having a wrench put on. So if you have to adjust something, the bolt strips right away just because it's made of the cheapest possible material. Now, if all you have in your bank account for buying a bike is a bike from a big box store, then that's what you should do and make the best of it. Get to know a good bike shop, because I can tell you there is nobody at Target or Walmart or Kmart who knows how to repair or service a bike. Once it goes out the door, they don't want to see it come back. The best they'll be able to do is give you a refund on something. So these bikes, you do have to work with a bike shop in terms of adjustments and keeping them tuned and running. All right, let us move on. Let's go to some of our questions here. So if I can find them. When I worked in the bike shop, people would ask, what bike should I buy? And, I don't know that person, what their biking priorities are, whether it's saving money, buying the most expensive bike, just getting around town, doing centuries. So I'd start asking them questions about, what's their budget? What kind of riding do they want to do? What do they see themselves doing with a bike? So let's get to Trisha's question. How do you know what kind of bike to get? So Trisha, I would ask yourself some questions. One is, what type of riding do you see yourself doing? Do you see yourself doing just riding around your neighborhood, riding around town, running errands, riding to work? Do you want to carry stuff on your bike, like groceries, running errands? Do you need to carry laptop, computer, paperwork to and from your office, things like that? How far are you going? How often do you want to ride? Do you see yourself riding in bad weather? Do you want to go fast and far? Do you want to race? Do you want to ride off-road on trails? So, you know, some of these bikes will do some of these things. Some of them will do all of them, maybe not very well, but it will do all of them. And some bikes are highly, highly specialized and designed to do only one thing. What I emphasize, because a lot of people are like, oh, I like that pretty bike. And it's like, all right, but that bike weighs 2,000 pounds. It may not be all that fun to ride. And so, you know, figure out the answer to some of these questions first in terms of what kind of riding, what kind of functions do you need your bike to do? Once you sort of get that kind of stuff pinned down, you can always find a bike that looks great. Like if you want to buy a road bike, you're going to have 200 different choices of colors and things like that to choose from. And you'll be able to find a bike that looks good to you. And I think good looks are important for a bike. Like if you think your bike is ugly or unattractive, you're not going to take that out and ride it. I always choose bikes, you know, once I know what I want based on aesthetic appeal to me personally. Okay. So a couple of other considerations about buying a bike. One, you know, I highly recommend keeping your bike indoors when you're not riding. If you have to park it, you know, lock it up outside for, you know, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes while you go into the store, you know, an hour or two if you're at a doctor's appointment, dentist appointment or something like that. That's fine. Your bike can put up with that. But leaving it outside all day, every day is pretty hard on your bike. Leaving it outside overnight in all types of weather is pretty hard on your bike. Mother Nature alone is really abusive to bikes that sit out all day. And then there's the people who want to steal stuff off your bike, want to steal your bike, want to vandalize your bike just for the fun of it. So I always think that letting your bike live indoors with you and your kids and your pets is better for your bike. But that might be challenging. You might have a job that is not bike friendly. You might live in a place that has 1 million stairs to get to your apartment instead of an elevator. So that's something to also ask, like where am I storing this bike? If I have to leave it outside, maybe I want a used bike that's kind of already been uglified and people won't try to steal it and I won't be upset if it gets another scratch on it from something. Do you need to or want to take your bike on public transportation? Metro North, Long Island Railroad, New Jersey Transit trains. Some types of bikes are super friendly for that. Other types of bikes are somewhat less friendly. If you need to use an inner city bus to go outside the city, some bus lines are more friendly to folding bikes than other types of bikes. So that's also a consideration is if you need to travel with your bike. All right, let's move on. So budget. The answer to the question for all of my former customers in Rego Park Homes is you get what you pay for. That $89 mountain bike they saw advertised in the Kmart weekly ad is a heavy piece of junk. It won't hold up. It won't be fun to ride. It will be uncomfortable. It will be badly assembled. It's made out of bad materials. Even with bike shop bikes, the more money you spend, your bike is going to be lighter. It will have lighter parts. It will have wheels that spin up faster, which means your effort into the pedals requires less effort to make the bike go and make it go fast. And so that's what you get when you spend more money. Now, somebody had a question here in chat about how much they should spend. And I'm going to go back to that. So Tricia, was that about what kind of bike should I get? Was that helpful? You're on mute, or you can put your answer in chat. I can't unmute you. You have to unmute yourself. It's the little red microphone. Let me just double check that you're. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Try unmuting yourself now.
Oh, there we are. Thanks.
Yeah, sorry, I got it set wrong.
It's all good. No, that was really helpful. I think that as you said, that I was like really trying to analyze what my function would be for the bike, and in my head I am a beginner, so like ideally I would want to say like ride it to work and back, but I think I would do shorter errands first because I am a beginner.
So for a beginner, I would look at a basic, what's called a hardtail mountain bike, and we'll get to different types of bikes. Hardtail doesn't have a full suspension frame. In fact, if you can find a mountain bike that has no suspension, like no suspension fork, and those are kind of getting hard to find, the manufacturers have decided they need to put shock absorbers on the front end of the bike. But I just think in the city that just adds weight and you really don't need them. That stuff's for riding off-road. I think your other good option as a beginner is what's called a hybrid. And again, when we talk about different types of bikes, we'll cover that, what a hybrid is. But those are good all-around general purpose bikes for beginners. They can do a lot of things. You're not going to win the Tour de France with a mountain bike or a hybrid, but you're not trying to do that. And they'll be fun to ride and serve you pretty well. So let me.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I mean the other thing is like how do you want to? Another question you want to ask yourself is, how do I want to dress when I'm riding a bike? Like, if you want to wear skirts and dresses as a woman, getting a step-through frame might work better for that than a regular frame. They used to be called women's frames or ladies' frames. But the industry is kind of changing its nomenclature to make it gender neutral. And I think that's fine because it's just a bike. It's an inanimate object. So anyway, let me move on. Tricia had also asked a question. Is it okay to be fiscally conservative when purchasing your first bike? Or should it be more high quality on the expensive side? So I think I don't have a great answer for that question. And you can see from our slide here that, spending more money is going to get you certain things, especially weight savings on the bike. If you have to carry that bike up 5 flights of stairs, maybe springing for a lighter bike is going to be worthwhile to you. But I'm going to say buying a bike at a bike shop, if you start out and spend the minimum at a bike shop, say a $350 mountain bike, you're going to get a decent bike that'll work pretty well as long as it's given some reasonable basic maintenance and not left outside, you know, in the rain and the winter all the time. If you decide, hey, I really love that $900 bike instead, you'll get a bike with maybe a somewhat nicer frame, nicer wheels, and lighter, probably better functioning components. You know, what you get on the more expensive bikes in terms of the parts. The most important part of the bike is the frame. That's the skeleton of the bike. And that's the most important part. You can't replace the frame. It needs to fit you. It needs to be made of good quality materials. It needs to ride comfortably. The second most important part of the bike probably are the wheels. That's the second heaviest part, probably the second most expensive, if not the most expensive part. They need to be durable and hold up, but they also need to not like hold you back. And when you put effort into the riding, they need to, you know, be your partner and spin up fast and be able to do what you want to do. From there, it's just like better quality parts. So some people, like, you know, buying a $350 bike, you might get an 8-speed gear system in the back, and it'll be fine and it'll work fine. And there will be replacement parts for 8-speed for years and years to come. But the bike industry has decided to sell to the Walmart super people of the world, not Walmart, Wall Street superheroes of the world who want to buy a $10,000 bike with 12 speeds in the back. Well, that 12 speeds isn't going to make anybody go any faster. You know, a $350 bike, you'll get, say, maybe V brakes. We'll go through some of these parts later. Whereas the $900 bike, you might get hydraulic disc brakes. And you'll notice, even though V brakes are pretty powerful brakes, hydraulic disc brakes are way more powerful and probably less finicky in terms of adjustment and maintenance. All right, let's move on. So bike sizing. Your typical frame is going to look something like this with a top tube. This is the top tube right here that starts at the top of the head tube, which is the front part of the frame, and goes across to near the top of what's called the seat tube. So an important thing you're going to need to know is your standover height, which is the measurement from your crotch to the floor. And you can measure that with a measuring tape and a ruler, or a measuring tape and a level, but you're going to need to know that measurement. If you were getting a step-through frame, and a step-through frame is where this tube, instead of going to the top, it angles down into the middle right here. It's still a good idea to know that standover measurement, your measurement right here, because they will produce those step-through frames in different sizes. Now, bikes are sized, adult bikes at least. Kids' bikes don't do this, but adult bikes are sized from the center here. There's a little bolt in the crank to somewhere up here. Some manufacturers measure it to this right here, this joint. Others will add an extra inch or two to the top of this tube. So when your frame size says 15 inches, that's the measurement from here to somewhere in here. If it's a road bike, it's probably measured in metric, and it might be something like 52 centimeters. They're always usually measured in centimeters. The measurement's the same though. It's from the center here of this bottom bracket bearing up this seat tube to the top. Even with a step-through frame where this top tube comes down in the middle, and it seems like you should have plenty of what's called standover height. it's still measured along the full length of this tube. Now, your standover height is going to be the measurement from here to the ground on a bike. And it has to be at least 1 to 2 inches shorter than your crotch to ground measurement or your inseam measurement. So I have an inseam measurement of 32 inches. That's how long my legs are, legs and feet to the ground. So when I'm looking at the geometry, I can't talk, the geometry diagrams, if I'm 32 inches, I want to make sure that I buy a bike or a frame with a standover of 31 or 30 inches. Because if I get one with 32 inches, that means this top bar is going to be touching my body when I stand over the bike. And that's going to be just a little bit too big. And in an emergency panic stop dismount situation, I could injure myself by coming down on top of this top tube. So let me just show you something. We're going to go to the Bikes Direct website here. Bear with me. Okay, give me a second here. Let's go to Jamis, not Bikes Direct. I like Jamis, except I always get this problem with them. Jamis, by the way, is a local company. Woman owned, by the way. Daughter of the founder, lives on the Upper West Side, and the company is headquartered right along New York state line. Now, I'm not trying to advertise for Jamis here. I've owned a bunch of their bikes over the years. And we're going to just pick out one of their bikes. I'm going to go to street. And I'm going to go to urban. And I'm going to pick out one of the sequel bikes. Oh, look at that nice brown color. And you can do this. You can go look online, Cannondale, Trek, Giant, look at their websites for the types of catalogs or for the types of bikes that you're looking for. Now they have 2 models of this. I'm going to go look at the less expensive one. The frames are designed exactly the same on these bikes. I should probably share the screen at this point so you can actually see what I'm doing. Here we go. All right, you should be seeing the Jamis sequel bicycle. And this is the page that describes it. And somewhere on that page, they are going to talk about geometry. They might use the word geometry or fit and sizing. Look at that. So if you are looking at a specific bike, go look at their geometry chart or their fit and sizing chart to determine what size you need. And looky here, dimension B, the standover, I think is the most important part. It's the part you have to start with. And no, wait, it's dimension J here on this one. Sorry, I was misreading. Dimension J is the standover. And B is the top tube. So as bikes get taller, this part here is going to get longer. And a few of the other parts will get changed and tweaked as well. And you can go to this little chart and it will list the different sizes of bikes or frames that they offer. So this one goes from 15, which is small but not extra small, up to 23, which is like NBA sized, if you're an NBA player. And I want to look at J. What's the standover? What size should I buy? And so I'm going to look at standover right here. And I know that I'm a 32, so 15 might be a little bit small, but 17 is 29 inches. So either the 17 or the 19. I'm thinking the 19 might start being a little too big for me. So I would probably go for a 17 if I was buying this bike, because it would give me about 3 inches, less than 3 inches of clearance between my body and the top tube right here on this bike. Every model of bike on every bike manufacturer's webpage will have a view like this, where you can look at the geometry and figure out what size you're going to need. But a bike shop can also help you with this. That's a pretty quick and easy thing to determine. I could look at somebody who's short and say, okay, you're going to need a 15 in this bike. All right, so that's one thing to know is the standover height. The other thing to know is, different types of bikes have different wheel sizes, and that's also going to affect how a bike fits. So a road bike is usually going to have 700C wheels. That's about 28 inches. Interestingly enough, certain types of mountain bikes have also 700C wheels, but they call them 29 inch. The rim diameter is exactly the same. And theoretically, a road bike tire would fit on that 29-inch mountain bike frame. Now, there are road bikes for shorter people that come in a wheel size called 650C, or if you were like really, really short as an adult, you could find a kid's road bike. Some of the manufacturers are making some fairly decent kids' road bikes. You just won't have as good of a choice as you would in the adult sizes. Mountain bikes will come in generally 3 different wheel sizes. 26 is the traditional size, and that's kind of become eclipsed by 29 or 27.5, also known as 650B. So there's a lot of like confusing numbers with wheel sizes. But those things, the wheel size, the tire size, that will affect the standover height. So given the way they've spec'd the bike with the tire that they've chosen and the wheel size they've chosen, you need to look at the standover height for your bike on that geometry frame. And if you're shopping and you're curious, let me go back to this. You can just look and see, hey, what's my bike made of? What'd they make the frame out of? Here we go, the specifications. It's steel, 4130 double-butted chromoly. That's pretty nice. A lot of this stuff's going to be confusing because it's technical terminology or brand names for the different parts. But if there's something specific that you're looking for, like I want a certain brand of rear derailleur, or I want a certain level of rear derailleur, or I want hydraulic disc brakes, and you can't tell from looking at the picture, you can go down here. What kind of brakes does it have? Well, it has hydraulic disc brakes. Good, if that's what I want. All right, let's move on. Let's go back to our presentation. All right. So one of my big mistakes one time was mixing up apples and oranges. I sort of knew I was generally a certain type of size in a road bike, like a 52, and I was buying a hybrid frame off of eBay. Well, the thing is, these frames are designed differently. depending on their purpose, these angles change, the lengths of the tubes change, the distance from this bottom bracket bearing to the ground changes. And so I looked at this hybrid on eBay and I did the math and I said, well, it says it's such and such size of frame, and that's consistent with 52 centimeters for a road bike. It's about the same size, so I'll buy it. And it totally didn't fit me after I got the whole thing built up. It was, I think, too big because it was just a totally different type of bike meant for different purposes. And particularly the bottom bracket distance to the ground was very different from my road bikes. So that was probably one of my bigger goof ups in terms of shopping for a bike and a frame, was thinking that 52 in one type of bike means the same thing as 52 in another type of bike, and it totally did not.
Excuse me, Rich?
Yep.
Is sizing a bike, from what I've discerned in my experience, but with a hybrid, it's a lot like buying a pair of jeans. One waist and length size in Levi's and the same numbers for Lee's, Wranglers, and Gaps. It may not just fit the same. And there's no substitute for just getting on the bike and riding it and test riding it. I've discovered that the same hybrid size bike, that standover height or the bottom bracket to the top of the seat tube height, the top tube length is just as important, because in the same 15-inch or 16-inch height, I can't reach the handlebars because the top tubes may be a varying length.
Yeah, so I mean, I think you're generally right. In say you're buying a hybrid and you know your height and your inseam, your leg length, probably one hybrid is going to fit very similar to another. But let's say you own a basic hybrid and you decide to buy a much sportier, say, sport fitness hybrid made of a carbon fiber frame. You may find that thing fits a little differently, especially in the top tube area, which is the length here. I've bought road bikes that I'm like, gee, this thing seems to just, even though it's the same size, the fit is a little off from some of my other road bikes. And some of that has to do with what the bike is designed to do. Like road bikes, there's different types of road bikes. When I was in the truck store, they were like, oh, this is a racing bike, and this is what do they call it? An endurance bike. Well, an endurance bike might be super light and you can go fast on it, but it's meant for a different purpose, riding centuries and long distance charity rides at a reasonably fast pace than, say, winning a race. So they tweak the geometry a little bit, probably more in the top tube and the stem and some other parts of the bike. Same thing with mountain bikes. You can buy a basic hardtail mountain bike that should have maybe 2 to 3 inches of standover. But let's say you want to buy a downhill mountain bike or a jumping mountain bike where you are jumping off of ledges and stuff. You're going to want a lot more than 1 to 2 inches of clearance for that kind of application. So it's sort of, what do you want to do? You've already figured out generally what type of bike, maybe a hybrid, maybe a mountain bike. Within that category, what do you want to do with that bike? And then that also affects what size you're going to buy and what the standover is and what the top tube length is or should be for that type of bike. So let's talk a little bit about comfort now. As I think you may have picked up, comfort has a lot to do with the frame itself, the materials that it's made of, the way the frame is designed to fit your body, your height, your upper body, your torso length, your arm length, things like that. Even the materials that the frame is made out of affect the comfort of the bike. double butted steel frames ride way more comfortably than straight gauge high tensile steel frames. They're two different materials, even though they're both steel and a magnet sticks to them. One is a much more expensive high-end frame. The other is very cheaply manufactured. Now, some bikes, in terms of your comfort, you're going to want to maybe look at the saddle. Now, a big, fat, wide, cushy saddle like this may not be necessarily more comfortable because it's also the shape of the saddle and how that saddle fits your pelvic bone. And I would not take a saddle out like this for a long distance century ride. I think it would be horribly uncomfortable, not to mention heavy. A lot of people look at this Brooks saddle and they will say that thing is hard as a rock, and it is. But the thing about the Brooks saddle is it's made of leather, which eventually conforms and shapes to your pelvic bone as you use it. So it actually feels quite comfortable. Now, a lot of people think that suspension is a comfort feature, and suspension is actually kind of a, here you can see a suspension system on the frame. The frame is designed this way. It can certainly take the edge off the bumps, and you'll feel like, wow, that thing's like riding a Cadillac down the street. Actually, what suspension is for is to keep the wheels on the ground when you're riding on technical, rocky, off-road mountain bike terrain. It also helps with comfort for those types of rides, but it's really not meant to take the edge off the potholes and the rough pavement in the city. Things like wider, fatter tires and how much you inflate the tires can also affect how comfortable a bike is in terms of what it feels like when you're rolling down whatever surface you're on. All right, let's go through some basic categories of bikes and give you kind of an idea of what's out there. So one category bike is a mountain bike. Now, if you are buying a bike to ride around in the city and you decide you want to go with a mountain bike, I would go very basic for something like that. Go with an unsuspended frame. In other words, don't get one of these spring-loaded systems. Don't go with a fork that has a lot of suspension travel to it. If you can, go with an unsuspended fork. This is actually probably a downhill jump off cliffs type of mountain bike if you look at the amount of suspension that it has. I like mountain bikes because they give you a more upright ride than, say, road racing bikes. Most of them can haul stuff, especially at the more entry-level prices. They're a good general all-purpose bike. They will probably be heavier, especially because of the suspension components. It is getting harder to find mountain bikes that don't have at least a front suspension fork on them. Another category of bikes are road bikes. I should probably put some extra pictures of different types of mountain bikes on that previous slide. And as I said, there's different types of road bikes. You can buy a bike that's simply meant for sheer speed and winning races. My boss one time, years ago, when he was new at Bike New York, he was shopping for a new bike. He wanted a serious bike, and he was looking around. He was asking me a lot of questions, and I was kind of steering him towards a nice, high-quality hybrid. And he sent me a picture of a triathlon bike, which I don't have on this slide here. The thing looked like the Starship Enterprise. I was like, you're going to hate riding that bike. It is meant for one thing. You have one riding position. It's going to be stiff as a board. It's meant to be a rocket. And it's a one-trick pony. So I do have three or four really nice road bikes, and I love riding them, but I can't carry anything with them. If I want to carry something, I have to use a backpack. Now, there are types of road bikes that are good at carrying stuff and are good at going off-road. Your typical road racing bike or road endurance bike is going to have pretty skinny tires for being efficient on pavement. They're going to give you a pretty aerodynamic position for cutting the wind. When you want to go fast, especially long distance, air and wind is going to be your biggest enemy. It's going to be your biggest source of resistance. So those bikes are good for that kind of thing. They're going to be super light, especially if you pay more money and start getting the most expensive carbon frames. But I like road bikes that can actually carry stuff. And I like road bikes that I can take on gravel roads, on dirt paths, things like that. So I like touring bikes where I can mount a rack. They have little spots on the frame where you can attach a rack. They have space in the frame for much wider tires. And the widest tire you're going to be able to fit on a typical road racing bike is 25 millimeters wide. Whereas my touring bikes, I can go probably up to 38 or 40 millimeters, which is quite a bit wider and gives me quite a bit more terrain choices. It also makes the ride more comfortable, if not slower. So touring bikes, and then there's a type of bike called a gravel bike, which is kind of similar. You're starting to see disc brakes on bikes, especially touring bikes and gravel bikes that have to haul a load or go off-road. If you are just staying in the city, a lot of people like single speed and fixed gear bikes, which are a type of road bike, but not really a drop bar road racing bike like this one. People like the fixed gears. So a fixed gear is a bike when you're when the wheels are rolling, when the back wheel's rolling, the pedal is rolling. You can't stop the pedals and coast the way you can with other bikes. So some people don't like fixed gears for that reason. If you don't like a fixed gear, but you want the simplicity, you don't want the derailleurs, the shifters, the cables, the extra chain, the extra cassette in the back, a single speed is very simple, and a single speed coaster bike, you can coast with it. Now, the downside of these is New York City does have quite a few hilly places, and it is very hard to pedal these things up some of New York City's bigger hills and bridges. All right, let's move on. So a hybrid is kind of a popular choice for a lot of people because it combines certain aspects of a road bike, particularly the wheel size, which is 700C, but with mountain bike components and sort of mountain bike geometry and riding position, and certainly mountain bike parts. So the shifters, the triple crankset that you tend to see on these, the wide range gearing to help you get up hills or haul a load. That's what you're going to find with a hybrid, but with a larger wheel diameter, which is probably better on pavement than the old 26-inch standard. Now, because mountain bikes have gone to 29-inch wheels or 650B, what's also called 27.5, the wheel size issue is kind of the difference between hybrids and mountain bikes. It's kind of disappeared there. Although you can put much fatter tires on those mountain bikes than you probably could on a hybrid. Still, you can get pretty wide tires, 1.5 inches, maybe even getting close to 2 inches, 1.75 inches, or somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 millimeters wide. People like these because they're versatile. You can go reasonably fast on them, especially if you get the more sporty fitness versions of them that have, usually carbon fiber forks, aluminum or carbon frames, disc brakes. They'll be a lot lighter. People have done bike touring with them. They go on recreational trail rides. You can do bike commuting. They're pretty versatile bikes. Now, the thing about a hybrid is it does a lot of things pretty well. It doesn't do any one thing really, really well. So you can't really substitute a hybrid for a mountain bike if you want to go mountain biking. You can't really substitute a road bike for a hybrid if you want to do a fast-paced 100-mile century or charity ride. But it is a good all-around versatile bike. And then, as you've probably seen, if you've been walking around on the streets in New York City, folding bikes are very popular. And as I mentioned, they're popular because they're commuter train friendly. They tend to be more office friendly if you have a workplace that's not bike friendly at all. You can take your folding bike, fold it up, put it in its bag, carry it up there, and people think you just have a small piece of luggage. If you have a small apartment, a folding bike is a good option. It's less in the way than, say, a full-size bike. They'll tend to give you upright riding positions, although there are boutique manufacturers that make folding road bikes, folding touring bikes. I've even seen folding recumbents and folding mountain bikes. The folding mountain bikes will tend to have a full-size mountain bike wheel so that you get an actual mountain bike ride. But your typical folding bike is going to have either 16 or 20-inch wheels, which is going to change the gearing that they have to put on the bikes. I'm not going to get into that because it's kind of technical, but you have to have bigger gearing when you have smaller wheels. So there's some different brands. I would be very wary of buying a brand online, like going on eBay or Amazon and just buying whatever old folding bike. If you do buy a folding bike online, make sure it's a bike shop brand like DeHaan, like Tern, like Brompton, like this Strida is a good quality bike. There are some online folding bikes that are pieces of junk, and the ride quality is not going to be as good. The hinges will be sloppy, and the bike will have a lot of flex and play in it, especially as it gets some wear and tear on it. And then, of course, if you don't want to buy a bike, there's always City Bike, which is a great option for if you don't want to deal with schlepping a bike up to your apartment, to your office. If you don't want to deal with maintenance, spending the money on an annual City Bike membership is cheaper than buying a new bike. And if you live in the parts of the city that City Bike exists in now, you'll normally have access to a bike. Now, there are some inconveniences. You can't go on a national cross-country tour with one unless you rack up a big bill or you steal the bike. These bikes, you're limited to like 45 minutes if you're a member, and then you have to park it and pick another one. And then the availability in your neighborhood may be limited at rush hour if everybody gets to the City Bike station before you did. It comes with an app that tells you which stations have bikes or where the nearest station is when you need to park your bike. And then there's all sorts of other types of bikes. I own mountain bikes. I own a couple of these recumbents. I own a tandem. I own road racing bikes. I own touring bikes and gravel bikes. And I own a fat bike. I also own one or two, I have two folding bikes of different types. So needless to say, my apartment's a crowded place and all of my roommates are bikes. Now, somebody asked about different brands. Generally, within a given price range, let's say you were spending $500 on a basic mountain bike. your brands are not going to give you a huge difference in quality and value at $500. You might see one brand uses twist shifters and another brand uses trigger shifters. You probably going to get aluminum frames at that price point, not carbon, not good quality steel. You'll see a lot of the same parts. Like if you are looking at a $900 Cannondale and a $900 Janus, you're probably looking at the same shifters and the same derailleurs, similar cranksets, if not the same exact crankset. They'll put their own house brand parts on, which includes things like saddles, stems, handlebars, handlebar tape, grips, if it's a mountain bike or hybrid. Yeah, there's no free lunch in the bike world. Now, some of these manufacturers do have their own philosophies and areas that they tend to go to. So folding bike manufacturers tend to do only folding bikes. Brompton, Dayhan, Montague are all brands that make really good folding bikes. If you are looking for a steel mountain bike or road bike or hybrid that has good quality steel, don't look at Cannondale, don't look at Specialized, and don't look at Trek, because they've all gone to carbon and aluminum. You'd have to look at Janus to find a good steel bike. Although Janus also deals with carbon and aluminum just fine. Some manufacturers carry a much smaller line and they tend to focus on certain types of bikes. So for example, if you're looking at Haro, you're not going to find, I don't think, road bikes or probably even hybrids with Haro. Same for Redline. Redline tends to look at off-road kinds of biking. They don't really carry a full line the way Fuji, Specialized, Trek, Janus, and Cannondale do. And you can just kind of like notice that, or, you know, as you look through their websites, or if you go to a shop and grab one of the catalogs at the shop and take it home with you, you can see who's making what. Let's talk a little bit about different types of frame materials. I've already mentioned this a little bit. It used to be that, you know, you could have any type of bike you wanted as long as it was made of steel. And steel was affordable, it was cheap, it was strong, and if you paid more money, you could get a very lightweight steel frame. The key word to look for if you were looking at steel is the word butted. Butting means they make the tubes thicker where they have to join them and weld them. And then they're thinner in the middle. Butting the tube, especially because they now mostly weld these frames together, rather than brazing the way this lug steel would be, makes the frame stronger and lighter, and it also makes it ride more comfortably than if the frame tubes are the same thickness from one end to the other. So look at that label. You're usually going to have a label somewhere on the frame, if it's a steel frame, saying what it's made of, what type of steel. If it's a brand name like Tongay, Columbus, Dita, I'm trying to think who else is out there. Used to be True Temper made steel frames. Those are fine, but a lot of times it's a plain label just from the manufacturer, but you want to look for the words 4130, chromoly, double butted, or butted. Double butted's better. Now you do have to take care of steel frames in bad weather. They can be prone to rust. You don't want to take them to the beach and ride them around in the ocean. Frames can be rust proofed by your shop, which would involve some labor taking the bike apart and putting some rust proofing agent inside the frame tubes. I happen to be a big fan of steel as a frame material. Now, aluminum has come a long way. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, it was hard to find an aluminum bike because the aerospace industry was buying all the aluminum. But the Cold War ended, aluminum became cheaper, and people started buying aluminum bikes because they were lighter. Aluminum's about as strong as steel, but if it does crack or break, it is harder to repair. You have to take it to a specialty shop or take it back to the manufacturer, where steel is easier to repair. Anybody can, with a welder, can repair steel. Okay, so the bad knock on aluminum was it's light and fast and efficient, but it also is very efficient at transmitting road shock right up into your spine. And so it kind of got a bad rap for that, but aluminum's come a long way because the manufacturers have learned how to work with the material in terms of shaping the tubes so that they give a better ride. You can still buy that rocket fast, very harsh riding bike that's meant only to win races, or you can buy a nice plush aluminum lightweight bike where they've done a lot with the materials in terms of shaping them. It used to be that aluminum was just several pipes welded together, several tubes welded together, and that was it. And they didn't ride very well. That's changed a lot, and aluminum's gotten a lot better reputation. I think I have one aluminum bike. I'd owned a few over the years. I had one that rode pretty comfortably, and I had 2 or 3 that totally did not. But I'm going to say, if you walk into a bike shop these days, you're going to see a lot of aluminum. Now, it used to be that titanium was considered the high-end, boutique-y, pricey, bougie material in the bike world. And that's until carbon fiber came along. Now, titanium is very expensive because military and industrial aerospace still uses a lot of titanium. It's also a relatively rare and hard to work with material. That said, titanium is pretty darn light. It's just as strong as steel. It rides beautifully. The thing with titanium is you're going to have to go with a custom builder at this point. There aren't many companies. Le Mans used to do a few titanium frames. I don't think Cannondale or Specialized ever has. Kona has. In fact, you might still be able to find a few Konas with titanium. It's also usually got a beautiful finish, but you're going to have to go to a smaller manufacturer like Linsky or like Seven up in, I think Seven's up in Maine. There are a few smaller manufacturers, and that's almost like a custom bike at this point. And then there's carbon fiber, which is kind of, besides aluminum, taken over the bike industry at the more expensive price levels. It is extremely light. It can be shaped so that you can produce a frame that does what you want it to do. It does not rust. And most carbon that I've ridden on absorbs shock pretty well. Now, carbon can be prone to fatigue and cracking. It's mainly used for racing purposes, even mountain bike racing. You do have to be very careful. If there's any damage, if you have a crash or a fall, you want to take that bike into the bike shop for an inspection to see if there's any damage. Because when carbon fails, it fails catastrophically. It just like breaks apart. Whereas when steel fails, it kind of bends, it might crack, but and titanium, it tends not to fail catastrophically. But you're going to see a lot of carbon, and they do ride nice, and they can be extremely light, especially if they put more expensive parts on the bike. All right, let's talk a little bit about parts. If you are buying a mountain bike or hybrid, or some types of touring and cyclocross bikes in the road bike category, you're going to, at the less expensive price ranges, you're going to see these types of brakes, V brakes. They're pretty strong. But the biking world has really caught on to disc brakes, which is this type. And you're going to have two different options available to you for disc brakes. There's cable operated, which means they use a regular brake lever and a regular brake cable, which means you can get that if something goes wrong or you have cable wear and tear, you can get that serviced at any bike shop. The other type is hydraulic brakes, which uses hydraulic fluid inside of a little hose, uses a special brake lever that pumps the hydraulic fluid, special piston down here. Otherwise, the pads and the rotors tend to be the same. Hydraulic disc brakes are going to be more expensive than the cable operated ones, but the hydraulic ones are fairly more powerful. That said, cable operated disc brakes are very, very powerful. They're more powerful than these V brakes. Now, if you're buying a road racing bike or one of its cousins, a touring bike, gravel bike, cyclocross bike, road racing bikes, the skinny tire versions, are going to split their time between these caliper brakes, which are still on a lot of road racing bikes, even the really high-end ones, or you're starting to see disc brakes. A lot of road bikes being equipped with either cable or hydraulic disc brakes. For hydraulic on a road bike, you are going to pay some bucks. That's going to be a higher end, more expensive bike. Let's talk about wheels and tires. I've already said some about this. On the skinny end, you're going to have 700C, anywhere from 18 to 25 millimeters for a road racing bike. When you get into hybrids, gravel bikes, touring bikes, you're looking at anywhere from 28 millimeters on up to 42, 45 millimeters, but also typically 700C. Some gravel bikes and touring bikes have switched to what's called 27.5 or 650B, it's the same size. You'll see a few of those out there. And then if you're into mountain biking, you have three different wheel size choices. The traditional 26-inch, you'll find those typically on the less expensive bikes. More advanced bikes are going to have either the 27.5 or the 29. Now, the funny thing is if you buy a fat bike, those are almost always going to be 26. There are a few 29 plus and 27 or 27 plus, which sort of try to split the difference between a regular mountain bike and a full-blown fat bike. Your wheels, you want aluminum rims, you want stainless steel spokes. That's going to be pretty standard. On really high-end bikes, you might start seeing carbon fiber rims, maybe even carbon fiber spokes. Some road bikes, I know Mavic makes a wheel with carbon fiber spokes. The big new technology with wheels and tires right now is what's called tubeless. A traditional tire and tube, tire setup, has a tube inside here, and that's what holds the air. And so it's a little extra weight. It's maybe a quarter of a pound or half a pound at the most, depending on the size of your bike. The tubeless wheels use usually a special type of rim and a special type of strip inside the rim that makes the rim airtight. Standard issue bike rim is not airtight. And then they use a special tire that grips that rim, and usually you have to use something to help it sort of stick to the rim when you put air in it. But the thing is, they put a solution inside the tire that if you get a puncture, like let's say you run over a tack or a piece of glass that punctures a hole in your tire, that sealant is going to plug the leak, plug the air leak, and it will do it pretty quickly. A lot of people are swearing by these. The challenging part of this is that it's easier for the ordinary home bike mechanic to deal with tires and tubes if something goes wrong. than it is to deal with this tubeless in terms of setting it up or fixing it if something goes wrong. But that's something to look at if you're looking at road bike, a higher quality mountain bike. Even if it's not gone full-blown tubeless with the sealant inside, they will at least have a tubeless compatible rim and a tubeless compatible tire, even though they put a tube in there. So just something to think about. Kind of going long here. I'm going to try and wrap up pretty quickly. Think about your crankset and your type of gearing. If you are using a hybrid in traditional mountain bikes, you're probably going to get a triple crank like this. That will help you go really easily up the hills. If you are road racing, you're going to have a crankset and a gear set on the back wheel that gives you much fewer choices, and they're designed to go fast. Then you have a lot of road bikes that are trying to sort of split the difference. They use, somewhat smaller chain ring, big chain ring, and a somewhat smaller little chain ring. And then probably a wider range cassette of gears in the back that allow you to get up the hills. But that's not really a racing bike. That might be something more like a recreational or endurance road bike. In the mountain biking and gravel biking world, what a one-by system has become very popular. A one-by system has one chain ring on the crank and no front derailleur. So you don't have any choices of gears here. And this will usually be a pretty low, easy gear on the crank. And then you have a huge gear range on the back wheel. I have a couple of bikes with 1x systems, 1x11. You can probably get 1x10 and 1x12 out there too. And I like them so far, but I do a lot of fully loaded touring, and I'm not sure I would take that kind of a gear system, hauling all my camping equipment and food and stuff. I still want a triple crank so I can pedal myself up the hills with all that gear. And then finally, think about what types of shifters you want. If you're buying a road bike, you're going to get different brands, 3 different brands, maybe 4 different brands, but they all kind of work more or less the same way. It's Shimano, SRAM, and Campagnolo. On less expensive bikes, you might find shifters like this made by Sunrace. But basically, the shift lever and the brake lever are integrated into one. All the brands work slightly different with the road bikes in terms of the shifter. You get the function of them, but they all work really well. Campagnolo is a little harder to find because it's considered a pretty expensive brand. Now, if you were buying a hybrid or a mountain bike, you're going to have a choice of either a pod shifter with triggers like this one or a twist shifter. And different companies, brands will put different parts depending on what they want to do or what they think that bike should have. And people seem to have their preferences. For mountain bikes, I'm a pod and trigger kind of guy. I like these things. But other people swear by their twist shifters. And that's fine. Really, really, really cheap mountain bikes, really cheap road bikes, you might find these old school thumb shifters on there. And they'll work fine. They're usually pretty cheap, but they'll work fine and work for a while. You'll usually get 1 click per shift on the right side. The left side will probably be non-indexed with a friction shifter that you have to tweak a little bit so that it shifts the chain and the front derailleur doesn't rub. All right, I'm going to call it a day there, but do budget for a helmet. If you buy a $100 helmet, it's going to give you pretty much the same protection as a $35 helmet. The main difference between helmets these days is you have people who like these sort of skate style urban helmets with a hard shell and less ventilation. And other people like these sort of more aerodynamic helmets with a lot of vents. They both protect you the same way. And then do budget for especially things like lights, a lock or a locking system. If you want to carry stuff, budget for a rack, budget for a bell. It's required by law in New York State. Whatever you want to do with your bike, you might have to buy some extra goodies. Like if you want to carry stuff on your bike and make your bike carry it, you're going to need a rack and some panniers. All right, I'm going to stop there because it is almost 7:30. I hope I've answered everybody's questions. Everybody is still unmuted. And I just want to leave a little time here for additional questions.
Rich,
Yeah.
may I please ask you a question about a category of road bike?
Mm-hmm.
So what is the enduro category? I had heard, and perhaps mistakenly, that this had more of a relaxed geometry, a higher frame, a higher headset, the top tube is angled higher. And if I'm incorrect, what is done on a road bike frame to diminish an aggressive geometry?
So you are right. Now keep in mind the manufacturers, their categories and the bikes they include in those categories can change from one manufacturer to another, and even from one year to another, or over the space of several years. But you are right. The enduro bikes are meant to be more comfortable on a long distance ride. They may change the things like the headset angle, the length of the top tube, the height of the headset or the number of spacers. They may tweak some of the parts, especially the handlebar, the stem length, to give you a different riding position that's less aerodynamic than, say, a road racing bike. The gearing might be different. I mentioned that compact gearing. The manufacturer's going to say, hey, you know, they're not trying to win a race here. So, oh, come on. Let's go. There we go. So you might get a crankset like this that allows for an easier climb up hills than this road racing crankset. So on this road racing crankset, the chain rings are 53 on the big one, or maybe 52, and probably 39, or sometimes even 42. Whereas this one would be 50, and the small one would be 36 and 34, which is actually a pretty good climbing gear. So those are the differences. But you know, sometimes the categories, you look at the Trek website and I'm like, oh my God, how many road bikes do they have? I've sort of lost track. And some of that's just the parts they put on it, maybe the different bottom bracket styles. There seem to be a million of them now instead of just one. Other questions?
Rich,
Yes.
hi. Thank you so much for doing this. Is there a specific kind of bike that has like fenders on it so you don't get splashed, or like if you ride through a puddle, or could you put those on like any kind of bike?
So, yeah, if you look under urban or commuting bikes, and you might have to look across a number of different manufacturers, some of them will include fenders already attached to their urban or commuting bikes. Some manufacturers on their touring bikes, which are really meant for long distance, heavy load hauling, like you're taking all your camping gear with you, have put fenders on their touring bikes. Most of the time with most bikes, that is an add-on extra that you have to buy from the bike shop though. And there's some pretty nice fender brands out there. If you want full coverage fenders that are kind of meant to stay on the bike, you want to look at Planet Bike as one brand, or SKS. Then there's the other type of fender that's really meant to be popped on and off, and it will maybe keep you cleaner than say the bike. But for Americans, American-made bikes, you don't find a whole lot of bikes that have fenders already included. But you can find them. You just have to kind of like look around. But I would look around under the urban and the commuting categories.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions? All right. Well, I hope I didn't get too much into the weeds. We went a little longer than we normally do on this class. I hope I didn't provide way too much information and confuse the hell out of you. But I appreciate your time this evening and coming to one of our classes. And I wish you good luck with your shopping. I find buying a bike is fun, but other people may not find that so fun. You might find it too many choices, too much terminology. But hopefully Santa or whoever will put a nice new shiny bike under your Christmas tree or other December holiday. I hope everybody has a nice holidays, and I hope to see you again at one of our classes soon. You will be getting a follow-up email from one of our staff members with a recording of this class, including the screen sharing and the chat questions. So take care, everybody. I have to stop the share on this. All right, have a good night, everyone.